for summoning the ferry. Walking down to Ulva ferry, you will see a sign with red and white squares and a slot. Move the slot so that it shows a red square, which the ferryman can see from Ulva. Then the ferry will come, but remember to cover the red again with the white part of the sign as the ferry leaves Ulva.
At the very beginning, as you are waiting for the ferry, look over to the island of Ulva. Around 60 million years ago, there was a volcanic eruption near Ben More. Layers and layers of molten lava built up to form Ulva. The basalt cooled quickly, so it was a weak and crumbly rock. As ice and weather eroded the rocks, the terraced landscape was formed. The sea level dropped and left many raised beaches and cliffs around the shore of Ulva and the west side of Mull.
The boathouse. The ferry house was built on top of the site of an old inn where you could not drink alcohol. In other words, a temperance inn. This is a picture of what it looked like about 80 years ago. Here travellers to Stafford stayed the night after making the journey from Saarland, Mull. The next day, if the weather was good, they rowed out to see the famous Fingal's Cave. In the 1860s, the innkeeper was charged 3 times with breach of his licence. Records show that drinking and dancing went on until the early hours. Who can blame them?
If you get hungry, you can go to the boathouse to get some cakes, ice cream, tea, coffee, water and fizzy drinks, or even a meal. All the oysters and other shellfish sold here are caught locally.
You might want to eat oysters at the boathouse. There are 2 kinds of oysters, the native oyster which grows naturally and the Pacific oyster which is grown commercially. Pacific oysters are farmed in the sea around Ulva. It takes about 3 years to grow oysters from very small to a selling size. The small oysters come from hatcheries in England and the Channel Islands. The oysters are kept in bags in the sea on steel frames. About 1,000 small oysters would fit in one bag, and about 150 bigger oysters can fit in one bag. The sea flows freely through the bags, and the oysters feed on the plankton. The quality of the sea makes really good oysters around Ulva. At the spring tides, usually twice a month, the growers get access to the oysters. They turn the bags and clean them. The oysters are graded. This is called intertidal growing. When you store oysters, you must keep the flat side of the shell at the top.
This is Sheila's cottage. Sheila McFadgen and her son Sandy lived in this cottage. Sheila was the laird's dairymaid and she lived with her son in the last thatched cottage on Ulva. Sandy died of a disease called peritonitis when he was 19. Sheila's cottage was rebuilt as a museum in 1998. It took about 1 year to rebuild.
This is the first signpost you will come to. When you get to it, turn left.
On your left you will see some turkey oak trees. We think the turkey oak trees were planted in the 1800s. At that time, Ranald MacDonald owned the island, and Sir Walter Scott, the famous Scottish writer, used to visit the island. He was very interested in trees, and we think he planted these unusual oak trees.
This is now called Ted's Shed. It was erected for the builders to stay in when they were rebuilding the new Ulva House in 1954.
Through the trees you can see Ulva House. This is a photograph of the old house. The old house was built before 1814 and burnt down in 1954 because of an electrical fault.
This photograph shows what was left of the old Ulva House after the fire. The new house is only 50 years old. It was built between 1954 and 1957. This photograph shows the house being built.
Dr. Johnson and Boswell visited Ulva in 1773 as part of their trip to the Western Isles. This is Brackadale Steadings, where the clan chief Lachlan Macquarie lived. In 1773, on a rainy October night, Dr. Johnson, who wrote the first dictionary, and his friend James Boswell slept here. Although they slept in elegant beds, the floor was wet with rain that had come through the broken window, and they got wet feet as they undressed for bed. Boswell wrote this about the visit.
Macquarie's house was mean, but we were agreeably surprised with the appearance of the master, whom we found to be intelligent, polite, and much a man of the world.
When you come to the sign that says all walks, turn left.
You are looking at Benmore, which is the tallest mountain on Mull. Benmore is 966 metres tall.
From here you can see Inchkenneth. Inchkenneth is named after St. Kenneth, who founded a monastery on the island. The remains still stand. Sir Harold Bolton once owned Inchkenneth. He wrote the Sky Boat song. The most famous owners of Inchkenneth were the rather eccentric Mitford family. Unity Mitford was a friend of Hitler, and she spent her last years on the island. Fish farm. There are about 1 million fish at the moment in the fish farm. There are 12 cages, and there will be 36 when the fish get bigger. It takes about a year for the eggs to hatch, and then 12 to 20 months for them to grow in the cages from smolts to full size. 6 people are working at the fish farm now. The fish farm gets power from a big generator. In the distance you can see the Isle of Iona.
On the shore, you will see many basalt columns. When molten lava cools slowly, basalt columns are formed. Basalt columns are hexagonal columns of molten lava, which have cooled very slowly. They cool from the middle and cool outwards. The lava shrinks and cracks like drying mud in the sun.
Look over to the left of the path. You will see ridges in the ground. These are lazy beds. Lazy beds are where crofters grew their food. They would grow things like potatoes. They grew them in strips. The ground was often boggy, so to create good drainage, piles of seaweed were laid in strips and covered in soil, and then the potatoes were planted.
To your right, you'll see Livingstone's Cave. Archaeologists from Edinburgh University have studied the floor of Livingstone's Cave. You can still see the remains of their excavations at the cave. They found a shell made in shells that had been thrown away, flint arrowheads and fragments of bone from lemming artifacts and children. This showed that people lived here as far back as 5,600 BC.
Find the ruined house with the marker inside it. This is Livingstone's Croft. Neil Livingston and his wife Mary Morrison
were supposed to have lived in Livingstone's cave with their animals while the croft was being built. They had 4 sons and 3 daughters. One of their sons was called Neil Beag, which actually means Little Neil. In 1792, they moved to Blantyre to get work in the mills. Neil Beag married Agnes Hunter from Blantyre. They had a son called David Livingstone, who was a famous explorer. In 1864, David Livingstone visited Ulva to look for the croft where his father had been born.
In front of you, you will see a standing stone. Standing stones in Ulva date back to the Bronze Age. Nobody knows for sure what their purpose is. Possibly they line up with the setting and the rising sun at certain times of the year.
The water to your right is the reservoir. Before the reservoir was built, each house had to collect water from the burns.
In 1947, a reservoir was built with money from grants. This photograph shows it being built. After the reservoir was built, pipes were put in to carry the fresh water to all the houses on Ulva.